All right, one of my favorite units in AP Environmental Science, Earth systems.
There are three properties of soil: physical, chemical, and biological. And the physical properties of soil refer to like the features related to the characteristics like the size and the weight. And the chemical properties are also important because they determine how the soil functions, like if it has clay particles or if it's ability to have attracted to mineral ions and or negative ions. And then the biological components that we've seen and talked about, that's a diverse group of organisms that live in the soil. And these three groups together determine the soil classification that we have. Physical properties of soil refer to the features related to physical characteristics like size and weight. Sand, silt, and clay are mineral properties of different sizes. And so this texture of the soil is determined by the percentages of sand, silt, and clay that are present in the actual sample. We can plot all this on a diagram and a triangle, we'll see here in a minute, and that allows us to identify and compare different types of soils. Each location on this diagram has three determinants, basically the percentage of sand, silt, or clay. The permeability of soil, how quickly soil draws and drains sand and particulates, is dependent upon its texture. Sand particles, they're the largest of the three components. They're packed very loosely together, and water can move easily between those particles. So the permeability depends upon the texture. And so here we have our properties of soil triangle. Soils consist of a mixture of the sand, silt, and clay, and the relative properties of these determine like texture and size of the particles that are there. You can see in this diagram that sand being larger, silt after that, clay is actually a really, really tiny particle. But clay is unique in that it's a charged particle. So here in Georgia, we have a lot of clay. We have a lot of red clay. And our water has that milky, cloudy texture to it, not because it's polluted, but because clay, which we have a lot of, is charged. And so someone else who's polar molecule like water likes charged particles, and so clay stays suspended in the water column. Uh, for a very long period of time, like forever. Like I don't really think it ever settles out. And sand is really heavy, and so is silt. It eventually settles out and can create clear waters, like the ocean and like the Florida beaches. The reason it's really clear right there, you can see all the way through it, is because the soil that is there technically is all sand, which is huge particulates, and so they just drop to the bottom. When we take these properties and we plot them on this triangle, it can give us an idea of what type of soil that we have. Plots on these percentages on this triangle shaped like diagram allow us to identify and compare different soil types at different areas. And each location on the diagram has three determinants: the percentage of sand, of silt, and of clay. And so at a point in the middle is what we call loam. That's a category A. And loam is 40% sand, 40% silt, 20% clay. And we can determine this by following the lines from the point to the scale on all three sides of the triangle. If you are not certain of which line to follow on this diagram, always follow the lines that lead to the lower value. So for example, if you want to determine the percentage of sand in a sample where the red colored dot is, right here, then if you're not exactly sure of the proportions, we just always err on the side of the lower values. But when you have the total of sand, silt, and clay, it has to equal 100%. We will do more of this in class and in lab. We've already talked about permeability, and the permeability of the soil depends on its texture. So its composition also plays a part in how loosely packed the particles are. That'll really determine how quickly it will drain. Clay drains much more slowly than the other two components. In general, Soils with a high proportion of sand also make it easy for roots to penetrate through, making sandy soil somewhat advantageous for growing plants, even like carrots and potatoes. Clay particles, they're the smallest of those three components. They actually pack really tightly together, and because they're so tight particles, vegetation can't move in between their particles as easily. Um, as a result, clay is less porous, right? Silt particles are an intermediate between both, and they basically drain and retain water. The best soil type for agriculture is a mixture between all three. Mixtures promote balance, drainage, and retention. In natural ecosystems, we see a various heterogeneous type of mixtures, and the types of plants that we have growing there can also help us determine what the soil is like and whether or not the soil is wet or if it's dry, if plants are thriving or not, can also help us determine what type of soil we're looking at. Perhaps you've heard of the CEC, which is the cation exchange capacity. That's the ability of a particular soil to absorb and release cations. If you remember from chemistry, if I were to draw you the periodic table, where are your cations? Well, they're everyone that's over here. So this chemical cation exchange determines the properties of soil and can help us determine how that particular soil is functioning. Base saturation is the portion of soil bases and soil acids expressed as a percentage. Because of the way they affect nutrient availability to plants, CEC and base saturation are important determinants of overall ecosystem productivity. If a soil has a high CEC, it can retain and release plant nutrients. If it has a relatively high base saturation, its clay particles will hold important plant nutrients like calcium, magnesium, and potassium, those cations we were talking about. And a soil with both high CEC and high base saturation is likely to be really productive and support a lot of high productivity. And finally here we have the biological properties of soil, and that refers to all the activities and all the living organisms that are living in it. There are essentially three groups of organisms that account for just almost everything, not everything, but almost everything that lives in the soil. Fungus, bacteria, and protozoans. I want to say that these three groups of things make up somewhere between 80 and 90% of all the biological activity, and they are all single-celled organisms. Rodents and earthworms also contribute a lot to soil mixing and breaking down of large organic material into smaller pieces. Earthworms are responsible for the abundant humus formation of soils. And so essentially everything you're walking on outside, that very top layer of fertile soil, that is earthworm poop. So all these things that are living in there, what type of soil do you think is best for contaminants or for pollution? Soils high in clay do not allow water to drain readily, and therefore they keep contaminants from leaching into the surrounding water and the groundwater. What is the ideal combination of chemical properties that support a high productivity? Do you remember? High CEC and moderate base saturation will promote high productivity. And high CEC means the soil is high in nutrient holding capacity because nutrients are essential for plant growth. Moderate base saturation indicates that elements like calcium, magnesium, and potassium are available for plants to grow. There's a lot of things that live in the soil, not just what you see here, but there's slugs. There's lots of herbivores that eat plant parts, plant roots, as well as the above ground portion. The majority of soil organisms are what we call detritivores. They consume dead plant and animal tissue, and then they recycle those nutrients back into the soil. Some soil bacteria, they're also super important. We've talked about them in cycles before. They fix nitrogen, which, as we've seen, is the essential part for all plant production.